Some ancient places don't feel like ruins. They feel like something planned too carefully. A city that appears fully designed from the start. Stone tracks carved across entire landscapes with no clear purpose. Structures aligned with the sky, built with precision we still struggle to explain. These aren't myths. They were found, studied, and they're still raising questions. In this video, we're exploring ancient sites that show a level of planning, structure, and understanding that feels far ahead of their time. And the deeper you go, the harder they are to explain. So before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Because some of these places don't just stay in history, they stay with you. The fortified city that appeared fully formed, Khirbet Keyafa. At first, it doesn't look unusual. Just stone remains on a hilltop, low walls, broken outlines. A site that could easily be mistaken for many others scattered across the region. Nothing immediately dramatic. Nothing that clearly signals how structured it once was. But as you begin to follow the layout, the pattern becomes clear. Because this is not random construction. It is organized, deliberate. A settlement that was planned before it was built. This is Khirbet Keyafa. And what makes it stand out is how complete the system feels, even in its ruined state, because the structure is still readable, the design still visible, the intention still clear. The city is enclosed by a massive stone wall, not loosely placed, but carefully constructed. Large stones arranged to create thickness and stability, forming a continuous boundary that follows the shape of the hill, adapting to the terrain while still maintaining a defined perimeter. And that boundary is important, because it separates space, inside from outside, controlled from uncontrolled. And that separation is not only physical, it is functional, because everything within the wall operates as part of a system. What makes this wall different is how it connects directly to the houses, because the buildings are not set away from the fortification. They are built into it. Each house sharing part of the outer wall as its own structure, creating a continuous ring of living spaces that also serve as reinforcement. And that integration is efficient, because it reduces the need for separate construction, strengthens the wall, maximizes the use of space, but more importantly, it shows planning. Because this kind of design cannot happen by chance. It requires a clear idea from the beginning, a layout that defines where everything will go before construction starts. And that level of planning suggests organization, because it means that the builders were not working individually. They were working within a system. The city has 2 gates placed on different sides of the wall, and that detail matters, because most settlements of this scale tend to have a single controlled entry point. Adding a second gate increases accessibility, but also increases risk, meaning that its placement must be intentional. And here it is. Each gate aligned with the surrounding terrain, connected to paths that extend beyond the city, indicating that movement in and out was structured, not random. And that structure reflects awareness, because controlling access is not just about defense, it is about managing flow, people, goods, interaction with the outside world. The location of the site reinforces this, because it overlooks a valley that would have been a route of movement, a space where travel between regions would naturally occur. And from this elevated position, that movement becomes visible, observable. And that visibility adds function to the site, because it allows awareness beyond the walls. It connects the settlement to the landscape around it. Inside the city, the layout continues to show order, paths between structures, defined spaces, areas that suggest different uses, living, storage, activity, all arranged in a way that supports daily life while maintaining the overall structure of the settlement. And that balance is important, because it shows that the city was not only built for protection, it was built for use, for function, for continuity. The materials used are local. Stone gathered from the surrounding area, shaped as needed, but used in a way that preserves strength rather than forcing uniformity, creating structures that are stable, durable, and integrated into the environment. And that integration reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders understood their surroundings, using what was available in a way that supports long-term stability. Even now, the site remains clear. The walls still trace the boundary. The foundations still mark the houses. The gates still define entry points. And that clarity allows us to understand how the system worked, how the space was organized, how movement occurred within it. But there are still questions. Because while the structure is visible, the full story is not. The identity of the people who built it. The reason for this level of organization at this specific time. The purpose behind certain design choices. These details are still debated. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it shows that even when the physical system is preserved, the context can remain incomplete. But what remains is enough: the wall, the layout, the integration. All of it shows intention, planning, execution. Because this is not a settlement that grew slowly without direction. It feels constructed as a whole, designed, implemented, functioning as a complete system from the beginning. And maybe that is what makes Khirbet Qeiyafa stand out. Not just because it is fortified, but because it feels finished. A place that appears not as a gradual accumulation, but as something that was built with a clear vision from the start. And that clarity is what remains. The tracks carved into stone, with no clear purpose. Maltese cart, megalithic network. At first they looked like marks, parallel grooves cut into rock, shallow at some points, deeper at others, running across the surface in lines that seemed too consistent to be natural, yet too irregular to immediately explain. But when you follow them, the pattern becomes more complex because they don't stop. They continue. Stretching across the landscape, crossing hills, descending slopes, splitting, merging, sometimes running side by side, sometimes intersecting in ways that create networks rather than single paths. These are the Maltese cart ruts, and what makes them stand out is not just their form, but their scale, because they appear across multiple locations, forming a system that connects different parts of the island in a way that suggests something organized rather than accidental. The grooves themselves are carved into limestone, a material that can be shaped but still requires effort to cut, especially in consistent lines, especially across long distances, where maintaining direction and spacing becomes part of the challenge. And that consistency is visible, because many of the ruts follow parallel paths, spaced in a way that suggests they were meant to guide something, to control movement, to define direction. But what they guided is not fully clear. One explanation suggests transport. The idea that these grooves were created by repeated movement, possibly from wheeled or sled-based systems, gradually wearing into the rock over time, forming tracks through use rather than direct carving. But that explanation has limits. Because in many places the grooves are too deep, too sharply defined, too consistent in areas where erosion alone does not fully explain the form. And that introduces another possibility, that at least some of these ruts were intentionally cut, shaped into the rock, created as part of a system rather than formed only through repetition. And that distinction matters, because it changes the question from how they formed to why they were made. The network itself adds another layer, because these ruts are not isolated. They appear in clusters, in groups, extending across terrain that includes slopes, ridges, and even areas that lead toward the sea. And that distribution suggests planning, because creating a network requires understanding how different paths connect, how movement flows across the landscape, how routes are established and maintained. But some of these roads lead to unexpected places, edges, cliffs, even points that extend into the water. And that is where the pattern becomes more difficult to explain, because if the purpose was purely transport, the endpoints would likely remain within practical areas, not extend into locations that do not support continued movement. And that raises another question, because it suggests that not all of these paths served the same function. Some may have been practical, others may have had different purposes, possibly related to organization, to marking space, to defining routes that are not strictly about movement in the way we understand it. The depth of the grooves also varies. In some areas, they are shallow. In others, they cut deeply into the rock, creating channels that feel more permanent, more deliberate, suggesting that their formation was not uniform, but developed differently depending on location. And that variation reflects complexity, because it shows that this is not a single event. It is a system that evolved, expanded, adjusted over time. Even now, walking along these ruts, the direction is still visible. The lines still guide movement. The pattern still exists. And that persistence is important, because it shows that whatever their original purpose was, the design was strong enough to last, to remain visible even after centuries of exposure. But there are still unanswered questions, because no single explanation fully accounts for all aspects of the network: the formation, the variation, the endpoints. All of these elements suggest that the system is more complex than a single function, and that uncertainty is what defines it, because it exists as evidence without a complete explanation, a structure without a fully understood purpose. The surrounding landscape adds to this, because the ruts interact with the terrain, following natural contours in some places, cutting across them in others, showing that the builders were aware of the environment, but not limited by it. And that balance reflects intention, because it shows that the system was designed to work within the landscape, but not be constrained by it. Even today, the ruts remain visible, traceable, continuing across the stone, and that visibility keeps the question active, because it shows that something was created, something structured, something repeated across space. And maybe that is what makes the Maltese cart ruts stand out. Not because they are large, not because they are complex in appearance, but because they form a network that suggests purpose while still resisting a single explanation, a system that is clearly there, but not fully understood. That uncertainty is what remains. The site aligned with the sky, Cañada de la Virgen. At first, it feels isolated, a quiet stretch of land in central Mexico, surrounded by dry terrain and open space, where the structures do not immediately rise above the landscape, but sit within it, low and grounded, as if they were meant to blend rather than dominate. But that first impression changes as you begin to notice the arrangement, because this is not random placement. It is structured, deliberate, a site where positioning matters as much as construction. This is Cañada de la Virgen, and what defines it is not only the buildings themselves, but how they relate to the sky, to cycles, to movement that extends beyond the ground. The structures are built from stone, carefully arranged to create platforms, terraces, and enclosed spaces, forming a layout that feels organized, even without large vertical elements, because the emphasis here is not on height, but on alignment. And that alignment becomes clearer when you observe how the site is positioned, because certain structures face specific directions, not loosely, but precisely. And that precision suggests intention, because aligning a structure with a direction requires observation, the ability to track movement over time, to understand patterns that are not immediately visible. One of the key features is the main pyramid-like structure, not towering in the way later constructions are, but elevated enough to create a focal point, a central element that anchors the site within the landscape. And from this point, the surrounding area becomes visible, open, wide, connected, and that visibility is part of the design, because it allows observation of the horizon, of the sky, of movement that changes over time. But what makes this site particularly significant is how it aligns with celestial events, because the positioning of certain structures corresponds with the movement of the sun and possibly other celestial bodies, marking specific times of the year when light interacts with the architecture in a way that is not accidental. And that interaction requires knowledge, because it involves tracking cycles, recognizing patterns, understanding how those patterns repeat, and then translating that understanding into construction. But the structures themselves are not only about observation, because within the site there are enclosed spaces, rooms, areas that suggest use beyond viewing, spaces that were occupied, used, maintained. And that combination of open and enclosed areas shows that the site was not purely symbolic. It was functional, integrated into daily activity. The layout also reflects planning and movement. Paths between structures. Defined routes that guide how the space is navigated, creating flow within the site rather than leaving movement undefined. And that flow matters because it shapes how the site is experienced, how people move through it, how different areas connect. Water management is another important aspect because in this environment, water is not constant. It must be collected, stored, controlled. And evidence of systems designed for this purpose shows that the builders understood the need to manage resources carefully, integrating that management into the structure of the site. And that integration reflects long-term thinking because it shows that the site was not built for temporary use. It was designed to function over time. Even now, the alignment remains. The structures still face the same directions. The positioning still interacts with the horizon. And that continuity shows that the design was precise enough to last, to continue functioning even after the original builders are gone. But there are still questions. Because while we can observe the alignment, the full meaning behind it is not completely preserved. The specific beliefs, the exact reasons for certain design choices, the full role the site played within the broader region, all of these remain partially understood. And that leaves space for interpretation, for multiple possibilities. But the physical evidence is clear. The layout, the alignment, the structure, all of it shows intention, planning, execution. Because this is not a site that developed randomly. It was designed, organized, built with awareness of both the Allard and the sky. And that connection is what defines it. Because it shows that the builders were not only shaping space on the ground, but aligning that space with something beyond it, creating a system that connects environment, movement, and observation into a single place. And maybe that is what makes Cañada de la Virgen stand out. Not because of its size, but because of its precision. A place where structure and sky meet in a way that still works, still aligns, still reveals patterns that were understood long before they were recorded. And that alignment is what remains. The city carved into stone towers, Goremi rock structures. At first, it doesn't look like architecture. The landscape feels natural, shaped by erosion over time, with tall rock formations rising from the ground like pillars, uneven and irregular, scattered across the valley in a way that suggests geology rather than design. But then you begin to notice something. Openings, windows, doorways cut directly into the stone, and suddenly the landscape changes. Because these are not just formations, they are structures. This is Goremo, a region in Cappadocia where the rock itself has been shaped into living spaces, storage areas, and entire networks of rooms, creating a system that is not built on the land, but carved from it. And that distinction matters, because carving into stone is not the same as building with it. It requires a different approach, a different kind of planning, because once the material is removed, it cannot be replaced. Each cut is final. Each space must be considered before it is created. And that requires precision. The rock here is soft enough to shape, volcanic in origin, allowing it to be carved using tools available at the time, but still stable enough to hold its form, creating structures that remain intact even after long periods. And that balance between softness and strength is what makes this kind of construction possible. But what stands out is the scale. Because this is not a single structure, it is a network. Multiple towers, multiple levels, rooms carved into different heights, connected by passages, stairs, and openings that create vertical movement rather than flat expansion. And that verticality changes everything. Because space is not spread outward, it is layered, stacked, built upward within the rock itself. And that layering creates complexity. because it allows multiple functions to exist within a single formation. Living areas, storage spaces, gathering points, all contained within the same structure, separated by levels rather than distance. The entrances are often small, controlled, leading into larger interior spaces that open up once inside, creating a contrast between the outside and the inside, where the exterior appears solid but the interior reveals depth, and that contrast shapes the experience because it hides the scale until you enter. It conceals the structure within the rock. The placement of these carved spaces is also intentional because they are not randomly distributed. They follow patterns, clusters, groups of formations that create communities rather than isolated units. And that clustering suggests organization because it shows that these were not individual efforts. They were part of a system, a settlement. The environment plays a major role because the rock formations provide natural insulation, keeping interiors cooler in heat and warmer in cold, creating a stable environment that supports long-term use. And that efficiency reflects adaptation because it shows that the builders understood how to use the landscape to their advantage, turning natural formations into functional spaces. Even now, moving through Göreme, the connections are still visible, passages linking spaces, openings aligning with views, levels interacting with each other. And that connectivity shows that the design was not only about creating rooms, it was about creating a system of movement. But there are also enclosed spaces that suggest different uses. Rooms that are more isolated, more controlled, possibly used for activities that required separation from daily life, adding another layer to how the site functioned. And that variation shows that the structures were not uniform. They were adaptable, serving multiple purposes within the same framework. The durability of the carved rock ensures that much of the structure remains visible, allowing us to understand how the system worked, how spaces were organized, how movement occurred within it. But there are still questions. Because while the physical layout is clear, the full history of how the site developed, how it expanded, how different areas were used over time, is not completely preserved in a single narrative. And that complexity adds depth, because it shows that the site evolved, changed, adapted over time. But the structure remains, the carvings, the layers, the connections. All of it shows intention, planning, execution. Because this is not natural erosion alone. It is shaped deliberately, with a purpose. And that purpose is expressed through how space is created within the rock, how movement is guided, how different areas connect into a single system. And maybe that is what makes Göreme stand out. Not because of a single structure, but because of how an entire landscape was transformed into architecture. How natural formations became part of a design system that still exists today. A place where the line between nature and construction disappears, and what remained is something shaped by both. The tower that rises from the flatland ziggurat of Dur Kurigalzu. Not because of detail, not because of decoration, but because of its presence, rising from an otherwise flat landscape where nothing else reaches the same height, creating a form that feels separate from everything around it. And that separation is intentional, because this is not a structure meant to blend in. It is meant to be seen. This is the ziggurat of Dur Kurigalzu, a stepped structure built in ancient Mesopotamia, designed not as a building in the usual sense, but as a platform that rises layer by layer, creating elevation where the land itself offers none. And that elevation changes everything. Because in a flat environment, height becomes significance. It creates visibility. It defines importance. It marks a point that can be seen from a distance, acting as a reference within the landscape. The structure is made from mud brick, a material formed from earth, shaped, dried, and then stacked in layers to create mass, allowing the builders to construct something large, using resources that were readily available in the region. And that use of material reflects adaptation, because in an area where stone is limited, earth becomes the primary building element. But working with mud brick requires understanding, because it must be shaped correctly. layered carefully, protected from erosion, and that knowledge is visible in how the structure still stands. The ziggurat is built in tiers, each level slightly smaller than the one below, creating a stepped form that rises upward in stages, rather than as a single vertical wall, forming a structure that is both stable and visually distinct. And that design is not only structural, it is functional, because each level creates a platform, a surface, a space that can be accessed, and that access is controlled through stairways, paths that guide movement upward, defining how the structure is used, how it is approached, how it is experienced. And that controlled movement reflects planning because it determines how people interact with the structure, how they move from ground level to higher points, how access is managed. The top of the ziggurat would have held a structure, not preserved today, but understood through comparison with other sites, suggesting that the highest point was the most significant, a place set apart from the rest both physically and symbolically. And that separation is important because it creates hierarchy, lower levels accessible, upper levels more restricted, the highest point reserved, and that hierarchy reflects organization because it shows that the structure was not only built, but designed to function within a system of access and meaning. The surrounding area also played a role, because the ziggurat was not isolated. It was part of a larger complex, connected to other buildings, other spaces, forming a center within a broader settlement, and that connection matters, because it shows that the structure was integrated into daily life, even while standing apart from it. The durability of the construction is notable, because despite being made from earth-based materials, the structure has remained, its form still visible, its layers still defined, showing that the methods used were effective, that the design accounted for time and environment. Even now, the ziggurat maintains its presence. The stepped form still clear, the elevation still dominant, creating a visual marker that defines the space around it. But there are still questions, because while the structure is understood in general terms, the exact details of how it was used, how often it was accessed, what specific activities took place at different levels, are not fully preserved. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it shows that even with a structure this visible, this defined, there are still aspects that remain open to interpretation. But the physical evidence is clear. The layers, the elevation, the structure, all of it shows intention, planning, execution, because this is not a natural formation. It is constructed deliberately, using available materials to create something that transforms the landscape. And maybe that is what makes the ziggurat of Durkur Galzu stand out. Not just because of its size, but because of how it uses simplicity, earth shaped into form, layered into height to create something that defines space in a way that is still visible today. A structure that rises not just above the land, but beyond it. And that elevation is what remains. The endless rows of stone that follow, no obvious limit, Karnak stones. At first, it doesn't feel like a single site. There is no clear boundary, no single structure that defines the space, only rows of standing stones stretching across the landscape, continuing further than expected, extending beyond immediate view in a way that makes it difficult to understand their full scale all at once. And that scale is what defines it, because this is not a small arrangement. It is thousands of stones, positioned in lines, forming alignments that run across open ground in a pattern that feels too consistent to be natural, yet too extensive to explain easily. These are the Karnak stones, located in Brittany, France. And what makes them stand out is not just their number, but how they are arranged, because the stones are not placed randomly. They are aligned in rows that extend over long distances, creating a system that suggests planning on a scale that is difficult to overlook. Each stone is different, some tall, some shorter, some wider, some narrow. But despite these differences, they follow a pattern, positioned in lines that maintain direction, spacing, and orientation in a way that reflects coordination rather than coincidence. And that coordination is important, because placing even a small number of stones requires effort, but placing thousands in alignment requires organization, planning, understanding of space, The lines themselves are not isolated, they exist in groups, multiple rows running parallel, sometimes converging, sometimes diverging slightly, creating formations that shift across the terrain while still maintaining an overall structure. And that variation adds complexity, because it shows that the arrangement is not rigid. It adapts, changes slightly, while still holding a broader pattern. The landscape plays a role in this, because the stones follow the contours of the land, rising and falling with the terrain, suggesting that the builders were working with the environment rather than forcing a completely artificial layout onto it. And that adaptation reflects awareness, because it shows that the design accounts for natural features while still maintaining alignment. But what these alignments represent is not fully clear. There are interpretations, suggestions that the stones may relate to observation, to marking positions, to defining space in a way that goes beyond simple placement. But no single explanation fully accounts for the scale and consistency of the system. And that uncertainty is what defines the site, because it is not a question of whether the stones were placed intentionally. That is clear. The question is why. The spacing between stones also varies. In some areas, they are closer together. In others, more spread out. And that variation suggests that the arrangement was not uniform, but adjusted, possibly over time, possibly based on different phases of placement. And that introduces the idea of development, because the site may not have been created all at once. It may have expanded, grown, changed as new stones were added, and that process would require continuity, a shared understanding that allowed the pattern to be maintained even as the site evolved. Even now, walking through the alignments, the direction is still visible. The lines still guide the eye, the pattern still holds, and that persistence is important, because it shows that the arrangement was precise enough to remain recognizable even after long periods of time. But the sheer number of stones raises another question, because moving and placing stones of this size requires effort, coordination, resources, and doing that repeatedly across such a large area suggests that this was not a small-scale activity. It involved planning at a broader level. The stones themselves show signs of shaping in some cases, not uniform carving, but adjustments that suggest they were modified to fit their position, indicating that placement was not only about location, but also about form. And that attention to form adds another layer, because it shows that the builders were not only placing objects, they were shaping them. Even the orientation of the lines suggests direction, because they follow consistent paths across the landscape, creating a sense of movement, of flow, as if the stones are marking something that extends beyond the immediate space. But what that something is remains unclear, because while the pattern is visible, the meaning behind it is not fully preserved. And that leaves space for interpretation, for multiple possibilities. But the physical evidence remains. The rows, the alignment, the scale, all of it shows intention, planning, execution. Because this is not random distribution. It is structured, deliberate, created with purpose, even if that purpose is not fully understood. And maybe that is what makes the Karnak stone stand out. Not because of a single feature, but because of how repetition creates scale, how alignment creates pattern, how thousands of individual elements come together to form something that feels connected, continuous, and intentional. A landscape shaped by placement, a pattern that extends beyond immediate understanding. And that pattern is what remains. The circular fortress, built as a complete system, Ekatorp Fortress. At first, the shape is what stands out. A near-perfect circle drawn in stone, rising low but solid from the flat ground, forming a boundary that feels intentional from the very beginning, not adjusted over time, not expanded gradually, but defined as a complete form. And that clarity is unusual, because many ancient settlements grow outward, changing shape as they expand, but this one feels planned from the start. This is Ektorp Fortress, located on the island of Oland, and what makes it different is not just that it is fortified, but that it exists as a fully enclosed system, where everything inside the wall is part of a single, organized structure. The outer wall defines the space. Thick, continuous, built from stone arranged to create stability and resistance, forming a barrier that separates the interior from the surrounding landscape in a way that is both physical and functional. And that boundary is precise because it follows a circular form, maintaining consistency throughout, showing that the builders were working with a defined plan rather than adapting as they went. The entrance is limited, controlled. A single main gateway that regulates access, creating a point where movement can be observed, managed, and restricted if needed. And that control is important because it reflects awareness of security, of how space is protected, of how entry is structured. Inside the fortress, the layout is equally organized. Buildings are arranged along the inner edge of the wall, forming a ring of structures that face inward, creating a central open space that remains clear. And that arrangement is efficient because it uses the wall as part of the building structure, reducing the need for additional materials while reinforcing the outer boundary. But it also creates a specific kind of space because everything is oriented toward the center, movement, visibility, activity, all directed inward. And that inward focus changes how the space functions because it creates a contained environment where everything happens within a defined area where the outside is separated and the inside becomes a controlled system. The central space itself is open, flexible, capable of supporting different activities depending on need, whether gathering, movement, or other functions that require space without obstruction. And that flexibility adds to the design because it allows the structure to adapt to different uses without changing its form. The materials used reflect the environment. Stone for the walls, local resources shaped and placed to create durability, ensuring that the structure can withstand both time and weather, maintaining its form even after long periods. And that durability is evident because the outline of the fortress still remains clear. The circular wall still visible. The layout still readable. Even now moving through the site, the organization is still apparent. The ring of buildings, the central space, the controlled entrance, all of it forming a system that can still be understood. But what makes Akator particularly interesting is how complete it feels, because it is not a fragment of something larger. It is a self-contained unit, a structure where every element is connected, where the design is consistent from edge to center. And that completeness suggests planning at a higher level, because it shows that the builders were not only constructing individual parts, but designing an entire system from the beginning. The circular form also has structural advantages, because it distributes pressure evenly, reducing weak points, creating a shape that is stable and efficient for defense. And that efficiency reflects understanding, because it shows that the design was not only about form, but about function. But there are still questions, because while the structure is clear, the full range of how it was used over time is not completely preserved. Different phases, different occupants, changes that may have occurred, all of these add complexity to the site. And that complexity shows that even a well-defined structure can evolve, adapt, change, but the core design remains. The circle, the wall, the layout, all of it shows intention, planning, execution, because this is not a settlement that developed without direction. It is constructed deliberately, with a clear understanding of how space should function. And maybe that is what makes Ektorp stand out. Not because it is large, but because it is complete. A place where design, structure, and function come together in a way that feels unified, controlled, and fully realized. A fortress that is not just built, but designed as a system from the start. And that system is what remains. The stone covered in symbols. No one fully agrees on. Mysterious Dighton rock. At first it looks like a single boulder. Large, grounded, sitting near the edge of the water. its surface uneven, weathered, shaped by time in a way that feels natural. Nothing about its form immediately suggesting that it holds anything unusual. But then you move closer, and the surface changes. Lines begin to appear, shapes, carvings that are not random, not the result of erosion alone, but marks that were made, placed deliberately into the stone, forming patterns that seem organized yet difficult to interpret. This is Dighton rock, and what makes it stand out is not just the presence of carvings, but the uncertainty surrounding them, because while the markings are clearly visible, their meaning is not fully agreed upon. The surface is covered with symbols, figures, lines intersecting, shapes overlapping, creating a composition that feels complex but not immediately readable, as if it follows a system that is no longer accessible in a direct way. And that complexity is important, because it shows that the markings were not added casually. They were built up, layered, possibly over time. And that layering suggests repeated activity, not a single moment of carving, but multiple moments, different phases, different contributors. And that possibility adds depth, because it means the stone may represent more than one event, more than one purpose. The material itself is hard, difficult to carve without effort, requiring tools, time, and intention, meaning that each mark represents a decision, an action that was not easily made, and that effort reflects value, because it suggests that the act of carving into this stone was considered important enough to justify the work required. The location adds another layer, because the rock sits near a river, a point where water meets land, where movement occurs, where paths cross, creating a space that would have been accessible, visible, and possibly significant within the surrounding environment. And that visibility matters, because it means the stone was not hidden. It was placed where it could be seen, where it could be returned to, where it could function as a reference point. But what the symbols represent is still uncertain. Some interpretations suggest that they could be connected to local populations, reflecting systems of marking, communication, or representation that were understood within a specific cultural context. Others propose different origins, different explanations, each interpretation attempting to align the markings with known systems, known patterns. But none of them fully resolve the question, because the symbols do not match any single system clearly enough to confirm a definitive origin. And that is what defines the rock, because it exists between recognition and uncertainty. We can see the markings, we can analyze them, but we cannot fully translate them. And that gap remains. The arrangement of the symbols also suggests structure, because certain shapes repeat. Certain patterns appear more than once, indicating that there was consistency in how the markings were made, suggesting that they were not random but followed some form of internal logic. And that logic is visible, even if it is not fully understood. Even now, the carvings remain, weathered, faded in some areas, clearer in others, but still present, still forming the same patterns that have been observed for years. And that persistence is important, because it shows that the markings were deep enough, deliberate enough, to withstand time, to remain visible despite exposure. But there are still questions. Because without a clear system of interpretation, the symbols remain open. Not meaningless, but not fully defined. And that openness allows for multiple possibilities, different perspectives, different attempts at understanding. The rock itself does. The rock itself not provide answers. It provides evidence, evidence of marking, of intention, of repetition. And that evidence is enough to confirm that something was done here, something deliberate, even if the full meaning is not accessible. The scale of the carvings also matters, because they cover a large portion of the surface, indicating that the activity was not limited, that the stone was used extensively, possibly revisited, possibly expanded upon over time. And that repeated use suggests continuity, because it shows that the stone remained relevant across different moments. But the exact reason for that relevance remains unclear, and that uncertainty is what keeps the site active in discussion, because it resists a single explanation. It remains open. Even now, standing before the rock, the patterns are still there. The lines still intersect, the shapes still hold, and the question still remains. Not about whether the markings exist, but about what they mean. And maybe that is what makes Dighton Rock stand out. Not because it gives answers, but because it holds something that continues to resist them. A surface filled with intention, but not fully understood. And that mystery is what remains. The structures built for everyone, not just one. Jerf El Ahmar communal buildings. At first, the layout doesn't feel like a typical settlement. There are no clearly separated houses in the way we expect. No obvious boundaries that divide one living space from another. Only clusters of structures that seem connected, as if they were designed to function together rather than individually. And that difference is important. Because this is not just a place where people lived. It is a place where people gathered. This is Jerf El Ahmar, an early Neolithic site where some of the most striking features are not the private spaces, but the communal buildings, structures that appear to have been designed for shared use, for collective activity, for something that goes beyond individual living. And that shifts the focus. Because instead of asking how people lived separately, the question becomes how they function together. The buildings themselves are often circular or semi-subterranean, partially built into the ground, creating spaces that are enclosed, stable, and somewhat insulated from the environment, using the earth not just as a foundation, but as part of the structure itself. And that design reflects adaptation, because building partially below ground helps regulate temperature, creating interiors that remain more consistent despite changes outside. But what stands out is the scale of these communal spaces, larger than typical living structures, more open, capable of holding multiple people at once. And that capacity suggests purpose, because building something larger requires more effort, more resources, more coordination, meaning that the function must justify the scale. Inside these structures, features begin to appear. Benches along the walls, raised platforms, storage areas, elements that indicate organized use, spaces that were not empty but structured, arranged to support specific activities. And that arrangement reflects planning, because it shows that the builders were not only creating space, but defining how that space would be used. The presence of storage within these communal buildings is also significant, because it suggests that resources were not always kept individually. They may have been shared, managed collectively, and that introduces the idea of coordination at a social level, because storing resources in a shared space requires trust, agreement, a system that allows multiple individuals to contribute and access what is stored. And that system is not simple. It reflects organization. The construction methods also show consistency. Stone foundations, walls shaped and arranged to create stable enclosures, roofing structures that would have covered the space, creating interiors that are protected, defined, and usable over time. And that consistency suggests that these buildings were not experimental. They were understood, repeated, built with knowledge. The knowledge, placement of these communal structures within the settlement also matters, because they are not hidden, they are central, positioned in a way that makes them accessible, visible, integrated into the daily life of the community. And that centrality reflects importance, because it shows that these spaces were not secondary. They were part of the core structure of the settlement. Even now, the remains of these buildings still show their form. The circular outlines, the internal features, the layout that defines how the space was organized. And that visibility allows us to understand their function, even if not completely. But there are still questions. Because while we can see that these were communal spaces, the exact nature of the activities that took place within them is not fully preserved. Meetings, rituals, storage, coordination, possibly all of these, but not limited to a single purpose. And that multiplicity adds depth, because it shows that these spaces may have served different roles at different times, adapting to the needs of the community. The fact that such structures appear at this early stage is also important, because it suggests that organized communal activity existed alongside early settlement, that the idea of shared space, shared function, was already present, and that presence reflects social development, because it shows that people were not only building for themselves, they were building for each other. Even the design of the building supports this idea, because the circular form creates equality within the space, no clear front or back, no single direction that dominates, allowing people to face each other, to interact in a way that is more balanced, and that design choice may not be accidental. It may reflect how interaction was structured within the group, but again, the full meaning is not completely known, and that leaves space for interpretation, for different possibilities. But the physical evidence remains. The structures, the layout, the features, all of it shows intention, planning, execution, because this is not random construction, it is organized, deliberate, built to support something beyond individual use. And maybe that is what makes Jerfelamar stand out. Not because of size, not because of complexity, but because of what it represents, a shift from individual space to shared space, a system where architecture reflects community, where structures are built not just to live in, but to gather within. And that shift is what remains. The tower built entirely from stone, Brach of Mausa. At first it feels too intact, rising from the landscape with a shape that is clear, defined, and unusually complete. The structure stands in a way that doesn't immediately suggest its age, because so much of it still remains, so much of its original form still visible. And that is what makes it stand out. Because this is not a ruin in fragments, it is a structure that still holds its shape. This is the Broch of Musa, a circular stone tower located on a small island in Scotland, and what defines it is not just its height, but how it was built, entirely from stone without mortar, using placement and balance to create stability that has lasted for centuries. And that method changes how the structure is understood, because without mortar, there is no binding material holding the stones together. Only weight, only arrangement, only precision. And that means every stone matters, because each one contributes to the overall stability of the structure, creating a system where the strength comes from how the pieces fit together rather than what holds them in place. The walls are thick, not just solid, but layered, forming a double wall construction with space between the inner and outer layers, creating a structure that is not only strong, but functional. And that space between the walls is not empty. It contains passages, stairs, internal movement paths that allow access to different levels without disrupting the outer structure. And that integration is important because it shows that the design is not simple, it is layered, complex, the entrance is narrow, controlled, leading into the interior space where the circular form becomes more apparent, creating a chamber that is enclosed, defined, and centered within the structure. And that central space is what anchors the tower, because everything is built around it. Everything connects to it. The vertical design of the Broch is what sets it apart, because instead of expanding outward, it rises upward, creating multiple levels within the same footprint, using height to create space rather than area. And that verticality requires understanding, because building upward in stone without mortar requires balance, careful distribution of weight, ensuring that each level supports the next. And that balance is still visible, because the tower still stands, the walls still intact, the form still clear. Even now, moving within the structure, the internal stairways can be followed, the pathways between the walls still visible, allowing movement through the layers, showing how the space was used, how different levels were accessed. And that movement is part of the design, because it creates connection between levels without exposing the structure to weakness. The placement of the broch also matters, because it sits in a location that is slightly removed, surrounded by open space, creating visibility in all directions, allowing awareness of the surrounding area, which suggests that the position was chosen deliberately. And that visibility adds function, because it allows observation, awareness, connection to what lies beyond the structure. But what the broch was used for exactly is still debated, because while it is clearly a constructed, organized, and functional structure, the full range of its purpose, whether defensive, residential, or something more complex, is not completely defined. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it shows that even with a structure this complete, this visible, there are still aspects that remain open. But the design itself is clear. The circular form, the double walls, the internal passages. All of it shows intention, planning, execution. Because this is not a simple tower. It is a system. A structure where every element supports another, where form and function are connected. The durability of the construction is also significant, because without mortar, the structure relies entirely on its design, meaning that its survival is a direct result of how well it was built. And that survival is evidence that the method worked, that the understanding behind it was effective. Even after long periods, the broch remains one of the best preserved examples of its kind, allowing us to see not just fragments, but a complete form, something that can still be experienced as a structure rather than just remains. And maybe that is what makes the Broch of Mausa stand out. Not just because it still stands, but because it shows how far stone alone can go when it is used with precision, when it is arranged with understanding, when it becomes part of a system rather than just material. A tower built without binding, yet still held together. And that balance is what remains. The underground city of tombs cut into stone. Necropolis of Angelu Ruju. At first the surface looks quiet. Flat ground, scattered stone, nothing that immediately suggests depth, nothing that reveals what lies beneath, only subtle openings in the earth that feel small compared to what they lead into. But those openings are only the beginning, because below the surface, the space expands. Rooms, passages, chambers carved directly into rock, forming a network that is not visible from above but becomes clear once you move inside. This is the necropolis of Angelu Ruju. And what defines it is not just the number of tombs, but how they are structured, because this is not a single burial space, it is a system of underground chambers, each one shaped with intention, each one connected to a broader layout. The method of construction is based on carving, not building upward, but cutting inward, removing stone to create space, forming interiors that are enclosed, stable, and protected from the outside environment. And that method requires planning, because once the rock is removed, it cannot be replaced. Each chamber must be understood before it is created. Each cut must follow a design that exists before the work begins. And that precision is visible, because the chambers are not irregular voids. They are shaped, defined, with walls that follow deliberate lines, creating spaces that feel constructed rather than hollowed out without direction. The interiors vary. Some chambers are small, others larger, some simple, others more complex, with multiple connected rooms, forming layouts that extend beyond a single space. And that variation suggests development, because it shows that the site was not created all at once. It expanded, changed, adapted over time. The entrances to these tombs are often narrow, low, requiring movement that shifts from open standing space into a more controlled, enclosed position, creating a transition that is physical, not just spatial. And that transition matters, because it changes how the space is experienced. It marks entry into a different environment, a space separated from the outside. Inside, some chambers show details that go beyond basic structure, carved features, indented areas, elements that suggest that the space was arranged, not just created, indicating that attention was given not only to the formation of the chamber, but to how it would function. And that function is tied to burial, because these chambers were used to hold human remains, often repeatedly, creating spaces that were revisited, reused, becoming part of a continuing process rather than a single event. And that repetition creates continuity, because it connects different individuals across time within the same space, linking them through the structure itself. The underground nature of the site adds another layer, because it removes the structure from immediate visibility, placing it beneath the surface, creating a space that exists separately from daily activity. A place that is accessed intentionally rather than encountered casually. And that separation suggests purpose, because it shows that the builders chose to create a distinct environment, one that is not part of everyday space but set apart from it. The material itself, stone, provides durability, because carving into rock creates structures that can last, preserving form, preserving layout, allowing the site to remain visible even after long periods. And that durability is what allows us to study it today, to move through it, to understand how it was organized. Even now, the chambers remain. The passages still connect. The layout still holds, creating a network that can still be followed, still experienced. But there are still questions, because while the structure is clear, the full meaning behind it is not completely preserved. The exact rituals, the beliefs associated with the design, the reasons for specific features, all of these remain partially unknown. And that uncertainty is part of the site, because it shows that even when the physical structure remains, the full context can fade. But the evidence is still strong. The chambers, the carvings, the connections, all of it shows intention, planning, execution. Because this is not random excavation, it is structured, deliberate, created with purpose. And that purpose is expressed through how space is shaped, how movement is guided, how different chambers connect into a single system. And maybe that is what makes Ankeluruju stand out. Not because of a single tomb, but because of how many spaces come together beneath the surface, forming something that feels less like a collection of burials and more like a constructed environment. A place built not above ground, but within it. And that depth is what remains.